Hello. This presentation will focus on two theories that are the foundation of all social work practice: ecological theory and the person and environment theory. This provides a framework for looking inside the system we're working with, such as a client or family, and outside the system we're working with, the environment, which are the mezzo and macro pieces, such as the school system, the community, and the court system, etc. Then I will go over humanistic theory as the basic theory we use in the social work relationship. So ecological theory provides a commitment to the broader social, political, and economic context, such as war, poverty, disaster. All of these have implications for vulnerability across our globe. Ecological theory also addresses poverty and injustice on a local and global scale, such as human trafficking. Also, it positions social work to expand defining characteristics of risk or vulnerability to incorporate what we call the person and environment framework. And this framework you will study in your Human Behavior and Social Environment course. And we'll talk more about it here. It also includes a commitment of service to others, which is very strong in ecological theory. So let's look at the person and environment approach. It is somewhat synonymous with ecological theory in that it integrates micro, mezzo, and macro level practices. It is embedded in the community, and it also supports a dual focus on the individual and family, at the same time within the local and global political, social, and economic structures. Causality of human problems is assessed as a dynamic process that crosses culture and time. For example, in the issue of human trafficking, we know that human trafficking as we know it today has grown over the last decade. And part of that is because of the increase in human migration and globalization. So over time, the kinds of problems that we face do change. Applying ecological and the person and environment theories or approaches to assessment in social work, we must look at the broad range of strengths, of deficits, or obstacles within the individual and family, but at the same time in the environment. So we have all of these factors that we need to look at. And they're very, very important in how an individual, a family, or a community copes. This we'll talk more about when we get into assessment and intervention of individuals. The historical development of the person and environment approach started with our pioneers in the early 1900s. Jane Addams and her work in the settlement houses in Chicago, and Mary Richmond and her discourse on social casework. Richmond's casework approach emphasized the conscious adaptations that individuals make in order to cope. She paid equal attention to the individual and social environment, and she advocated that when services were not available, the services that are needed, then social workers should push for them. So we must serve the individual through external influence as well as direct service provision. So there's a tension between psychoanalytic theory and social work. We began to see the rise of psychoanalytic theory applied to social work, which shifted the focus of social work from the environment to the individual. Parallel to this was the advancement of the practice of psychiatric casework or social work. Gordon Hamilton in the 1940s began to incorporate the psychoanalytic concepts and beliefs: transference, countertransference, defense mechanisms, resistance with more modern beliefs of ego psychology, which we will study later, and humanistic theories. In other words, He advanced the integration of the external and internal processes, person and environment, which is very similar to Richmond's approach. And then we began to see a refocus on the person and environment. In the 1960s, we saw an increased attention to community organization, policy design, and social action. This is when we had the war on poverty. And then in the 1980s, we saw a broad range of psychological approaches that were advanced. Self-psychology, task-centered approaches, cognitive behavioral and object relations theory, and couple and family theory. And then in the 1990s, there was an increasingly diverse knowledge base, which continued to be developed, coupled with increasing specialization and professional fragmentation, such as child welfare, family therapy, and addiction treatment. Sometimes we say this is the silo effect, that as specialization started increasing, then sometimes we lost the connections with each other. So let's take a look at humanistic theory. Remember what we have already talked about previously. Our theories drive our interpretation of our problems and how we design our interventions. Humanistic theory is basic to the primary social work tool in use of self. The social work relationship, I'm going to review some of the basic principles as we will be using these throughout the semester. They are also very evident in the strengths-based approach used throughout our readings and the text. So humanistic theory applied to the social work relationship comes from Carl Rogers. Individuals exist in a continually changing world of experience that only the individual can completely understand. Individuals react to how they perceive their world. Perception is very important. So applied to social work, we always want to know how a person sees a particular problem and how the different perceptions are operating within relationships. The best way to understand the individual is from their internal frame of reference, or what we call self-concept. So most ways of behaving are consistent with the individual's self-concept. We treat others as we treat ourselves. So in Rogerian theory, the self-concept is very important. It's not important in all theories, and that we'll touch on as we go through the semester. As the individual gains self-awareness and feels love, he or she develops a need for positive regard from others and self. So this is the positive self-regard. Conversely, when he or she feels unloved, he or she develops a negative self-regard. And when there's an incongruence between the individual's self-concept and experiences with others, a state of anxiety results. So it might be like an individual thinking or feeling, I'm performing poorly, but I must be seen as competent. This is their self-concept. I've got to be a competent person. And then this leads to what we call cognitive dissonance. So in order to lower an individual's anxiety, the self-concept must become more congruent with the individual's actual experiences. I may make excuses so I don't feel so incompetent. That job interview was bad because that boss didn't really ask decent questions. So this is what we get into in understanding a person's self-concept, how they perceive themselves, and also what their experiences are in the world and how consistent they are. So the truly self-aware and self-actualized person can respond openly and is flexible in how they see themselves. The individual is not defensive and can interpret experiences in different ways, in more realistic ways. For example, I am not performing so well, but I'm not perfect. I can learn from this. So you see there's more of a flexibility to how they perceive themselves and the world around them. There are issues of difference between social work and Rogerian approaches. The relationship and self-concept cannot always explain social problems such as poverty, family violence, addictions, and mental illness. We have to look beyond the self and look at the environment. We also need to understand unconscious motivations at times. What is motivating this person internally to, say, perhaps self-destruct or get themselves in relationships that may not be healthy for them? Also, sometimes we do need to take authority. We do need to be in an authority position, such as in child protection, when we might have to remove a child. But Rogers took an extreme position against authority. So this is an example of how one theory cannot explain everything. It can explain a lot, and it can be used in how we engage an individual. But we may need to incorporate other theories in order to understand the full picture and provide the most appropriate interventions.